Welcome to today's program on winter tree identification, sponsored by WOW Vermont. WOW Vermont is a collaborative effort between a number of partners: Vermont Land Trust, Vermont Woodlands Association, Vermont Coverts, Fish and Wildlife, Forest Parks and Recreation, UVM Extension, to bring women-focused programming about forest health and management to the public. And so this is one of our skills events that we're working on. We found through a survey that we did that people would like to do a little bit more with tree ID. And so we're kicking this off with the online portion today. And then there are going to be some in-person events around the state that will be coming up this weekend, the following weekend, and the weekend after that. Learning circles that will be started. And so we hope that you'll sign up for those as well. They are limited in number, so we're pretty close to capacity on those, but there's still a few spaces. We'll let you know if unfortunately you don't make it in, but we're keeping fingers crossed we can accommodate most that wish to. Anyway, I'm going to kick it off. We're going to have three different speakers. We're going to start with a little bit of background on basic tree ID and then go into some specific species. We were talking about this. This is a skills workshop. You're going to learn some techniques and tricks, and then you're going to have to practice these skills, which is where the in-person learning portion comes in. And then as any skill, going to have to continue to practice. So we're looking forward to kicking it off. We're going to ask you to stay on mute, to limit on background noise, and to ask any questions. Go ahead and type them in the chat box. Each of the presenters will be sharing their screen. So while we're switching screens, we're going to take that time to answer a few questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Nancy Patch with the County Forester with the Forest Parks and Recreation to kick it off. And she's going to pull her screen up and take it away, Nancy.
Okay. Thanks very much. I'm assuming you're all seeing my PowerPoint at this point. That's good. All right, so I'm starting us out, and I'm going to be covering a little bit about the kind of the big picture of how to identify trees. This is identifying trees can be complicated because there are a lot of things to look at, and one of the things we want to be really clear about that this is. You're going to get a lot of information here today. It's going to be kind of thrown at you, but don't get discouraged. These are just tricks of the trade that we're all going to be sharing. And then from there, going out and learning them little by little is how we do it. So kind of looking at that big picture again, as I suggested, is that, first go out. What are you looking at? Take a step back. How are we going to first divide these trees? Of course, winter time is different than the rest of the year where you have leaves to utilize, but actually bark and branching is really the very best way to identify trees because you can do that all year long. So are we looking at an evergreen or are we looking at a deciduous tree? Are the leaves, needles or leaves that are going to stay on all year long, or are we losing those needles or leaves in the winter? Because there is, in fact, a deciduous conifer tree in Vermont, the larch tree. So we know that those leaves do fall off in the winter. And then you want to take a look at, again, standing back. We've got silhouettes of our trees can really help us determine what they are. Just a few quick examples. Looking at these trees, these are very spired trees, and that's classic for balsam fir. Down at the lower corner, we have that vase shape that everyone knows when they start looking at trees and they learn their trees, that this tree is an iconic vase shaped tree, very large crown. And our sugar maple can take on a lot of different looks, but oftentimes you're going to see them, I sometimes call it the strawberry tree. Kind of looks like a strawberry upside down. So silhouettes can really help, and that's standing back and taking a look. The other thing that you're going to do in the very first thing, and the thing you want to continue to do over and over again, as a matter of fact, every time you have doubt in your mind about what that tree is, stop and look up. You need to look up to see whether those branches are opposite, where you see where I'm pointing with my cursor, where the twigs are opposite each other on the stem, or are they alternate? So that is going to tell you almost every time. You can be confused and look up like, oh yeah. So the thing about an opposite branch tree, and we're really focusing on trees today and not shrubs. So when we're looking at trees, the only two genera of trees that have opposite branching in Vermont that are native are ash and maple. So you automatically know that those are, if it's opposite branching, it's going to be an ash or a maple. I'll get into the difference between those in a moment, but also once you've determined it's opposite or alternate, you can start looking at the size of that branch. So a thick branch, like ash is a very thick branch because it has a compound leaf. And that compound leaf just needs more room in it for that bud to burst. So the branches are thicker versus a very fine branch tree like an elm or a birch. Those very, very fine branches, they have simple leaves. And that is kind of how that falls down. That's how that works out. Now, once you've looked at the branching pattern, and again, I say this all the time when I'm out doing a field walk, when people are confused between one tree or another, it's look up. It's going to help you. Don't forget to look up. But then look at those buds. There's so many characteristics of buds that are going to help you. Look at the color, and we'll talk about these specifics in a bit. This is a bitternut hickory, very yellow, and a red maple. Bud scales, we have naked buds, which doesn't have a bud scale on it. That's actually the little leaf that is just somehow protected in the wintertime. And that's a naked bud. Or we have a valvate bud, which there are two scales on this bud, or imbricate scales, which are multiple scales that fold over on each other. Also, the shape will help dramatically. Certainly basswood with this, what I learned in school being a motorcycle helmet for a mouse. Kind of a silly thing, but man, I remember that every time. I remembered it now for 35 years. Or we have this long cigar-shaped bud of the beech. And then clustered buds, sometimes you'll find on oaks. Oaks always have clustered buds. So those shapes will really help. And then when you get down to the fine tuning, you can start looking at leaf scars. And this is showing the different leaf scar. There's the bud, and the leaf scar is below it. That leaf scar is going to maybe tell you the difference between the three ashes, for example, or to show you that really dramatic butternut bud. Bark, of course, is what we're going to be seeing the most of when we're in the woods in the wintertime. So color of bark, texture, and patterns really help. So looking at that color, this is a paper birch or a white birch, same name for the same species of tree. It is a white colored bark. That's going to help. Yellow birch is a yellow, it's golden colored. It actually is, it's just a beautiful golden yellow tree bark. Texture is really important. Beech, with that really smooth gray colored or platy bark that you find on a cherry, or this exfoliating shaggy bark on this shagbark hickory. Patterns help dramatically. This is actually it's a bark canker that does this pattern. I'll talk more about that later on red maple. We have this diamond shaped pattern on ash, and then the lenticels that you can push and burst on a balsam fir. Seeds and fruit help in the winter a lot too, because the tree often persists and holds on to those seeds. So you can look at different kinds of seeds. We have winged seeds that include samaras, like the maples and the basswood, as well as catkins like birch. The nuts, we have beech and hop hornbeam, that you can see these little nuts and nutlet sacs, as well as berries on different trees. This is winterberry holly, and this is sorbus, or what does sorbus stand for? It's mountain ash, sorry. And then take a look at some books that can be really helpful. These are our favorites, I think. This one, Forest Trees of Vermont, is incredibly useful. It breaks down those buds, those leaves, the bark, the fruit, all of it's there, and it's only our trees in Vermont, and it's all the trees in Vermont that are native. So that is really a classic book. And I have to say, my newest favorite thing in the world is this app that you can put on your iPhone. It's iNaturalist based, and it's called Seek. And this is not just for trees. This is any includes animals as well as plants. So you can do a butterfly identification. I was just on a little trip to Arizona and I was using it on my cacti. So that was just incredible. Very valuable app, and it's free. So I'm going to dive in now to my few species that I'm going to cover today. I want to talk about maple first, but I'm really going to focus on just 2 maples as I go forward. There are actually 7 different species of native maple in Vermont. Our most dominant, most common trees are the sugar and red maples, but silver maple and box elder maple are native plants that typically grow in riparian areas along the shorelines and river edges. Mountain maple and striped maple tend to be upper elevation and are shrubs rather than trees. And then finally, black maple, which it can most often gets confused with sugar maple. It's a rare plant. You'll only find it in the Champlain Valley, perhaps the Connecticut River Valley, but I'm not sure about that. I've only heard of it in the Champlain Valley, and it's rare, so it's unlikely you'll come across it. We do want to point out that we do have one non-native invasive tree called Norway maple, and you'll often see that in people's yards with this burgundy colored leaf, but it also grows with a green leaf. And one of the ways you can tell this tree from another, and there are several ways, but for now, that tar spot, it shows up at the end of the summer. It's a disease, leaf disease, is very, very common on Norway maple. It's no longer allowed to be sold in the state of Vermont, and I usually recommend if you have one, cut it down and replace it with something else. It's taking over in the wild and pushing sugar maples out in some areas. Diagnostics that continue, branches and buds. As I said, the first thing you do, look up and look for that opposite versus alternate. Maple is opposite. They have paired buds. And to tell the difference between sugar maple and red maple, all you have to do is look up, because the red maple buds are round and red, and you can see them from the ground, no problem. Sugar maple buds are brown and smaller and very pointed, and you cannot generally, unless you have really fabulous eyesight, you cannot really see them from the ground. So it's important to look up again. I'll probably keep saying that. The fruit and seeds can help because they do persist. Along with the combination of looking at other things, you can tell the sugar maple from the red maple. And then that I'm adding this one once again for Norway maple, has a winged samara that is spread out like bird wings, as opposed to the helicopter wings, how they float down in the wind. This is a great way to tell that Norway maple. Diagnostics here for bark. Sugar maple and red maple, when they're young, are very hard to tell apart sometimes. That's why you once again will look up so you can see those red buds. But the bark itself can often be confusing. But if you, as an older tree, if you take your fingernail, your finger, and try to flick off the bark of the maple tree, if you can't flick it off, it's going to be a sugar maple. With the older trees, with red maple, if you were to flick, you could flick that little bit of bark off of there, and that's a very good way to tell the two apart. The other thing about red maple and silver maple sometimes, but red maple has this bark canker, which shows up kind of like a target. Some people call it cat face for some reason, but I often think sometimes it's only partially there and it looks like a smile, but there's these parallel lines, and you're never going to find that on a sugar maple. This will never be on a sugar maple. So if you see it, you know you have a red maple and perhaps a silver maple in the right conditions. Now, I just wanted to show you again quickly, the Norway maple doesn't look like any other of our maple bark. It actually looks a lot like ash. And so that's confusing. So you see this kind of ash shaped bark, but the twigs are again kind of fine. You're going to see a maple. There's lots of uses for maple, of course. It's one of our most important trees in the state of Vermont. It's our state tree, for example, and the wood is gorgeous, and it comes in all kinds of different grain patterns, including a spalted maple, which is the black line is where that tree is walling off future rot, and it just creates this gorgeous pattern that's often used for furniture and bowl turning. Of course, we know maple syrup And it's also a fabulous firewood tree. It's one of the best. I'm going to read this to you because I just wanted to add this in. What are the cultural considerations, the stories behind some of our trees? Maple trees symbolize balance, offering, practical magic, promise, longevity, generosity, and intelligence. The maple syrup produced from these trees was an important food source for Native Americans and for us now today, and has come to represent success and abundance. In English-speaking countries, this tree was believed to repel demons and evil spirits. It was customary to have a piece of a maple tree in the main door. Furthermore, it is an important tree in the Celtic mythology. It was a tree consecrated to Dana, the Celtic goddess of fertility. It is also known as the tree of tolerance. So I'm going to move on now to my second group of trees, talking about birch trees. There are 5 native species, and I say +1. I'm really going to talk about yellow birch primarily, but we also have paper birch and heartleaf birch, which are very similar, just different, a little bit different leaf shape. The heartleaf birch is very, very high elevation, so that's where you're going to find that. They were once thought of as a variety, but now they've separated each of their own species. We also have gray birch, which can hybridize with either of those. We also have black or sweet birch. That's the same name for a genus of tree, Betula nigra. And then I'm saying that +1 because river birch is not native to Vermont right now, but with climate change, wouldn't be unheard of to see river birch moving in to the state of Vermont. So those are the species of birch in Vermont. We also do have an invasive non-native birch, European weeping birch. So think about that when you're landscaping, is try not to get that weeping birch, European weeping birch. Now looking more closely at yellow birch is an alternate branching tree. It often has spurs, bud spurs. So you see lots and lots of different layers on that branch where it's been growing. It also has flower buds, so that you can see those on the tree. Looking at those branches and buds, first thing you want to do, this is a very good way to see yellow birch in the winter time. These catkins are mature and the tree will be throwing off seed almost all winter long. And that seed, which is located underneath each of these little papery layers, is shaped like a bird foot. And on the surface of the snow, you can see that, and it's a great food source for all kinds of critters, rodents, small mammals, birds. So looking for that bird foot shaped seed, look up and you'll see that it's coming from a yellow birch. So I'm showing you a lot of bark for all the different kinds of birch, but yellow birch, which we're talking about now.
Yeah, and it's on the list because Andy.
The yellow birch is a golden color and it exfoliates in shreds, not in large sheets like paper birch. It's called paper birch for a reason.
I don't even remember where this is. It's up north somewhere.
Maybe someone should mute there. Could you go ahead and mute? You're speaking over me here. So paper birch, and then we have gray birch, which is also white, but there's a distinguishable mustache and there's no exfoliating bark. So we can look at that in the field. And then we have black birch, which has these lenticels and can sort of, as it gets older, look a little bit like cherry, where it's real platy. But we're looking at this yellow birch, beautiful golden color, small strips of bark exfoliating. Again, the uses are wide, diverse. Birch bark is used for making canoes and Adirondack furniture. The flame birch pattern is gorgeous, so it's beautiful for flooring and furniture. We also make sap or pull sap out of it for beverages, as well as making syrup. And for medicinal purpose, some people are utilizing chaga, which is a hard conch fungus that grows only on birch trees. And there's a fairly good market for that. Now, birch in culture, this native tree holds strong connections with feminine energies, and in Celtic lore is known as the Lady of the Woods. As the birch is mostly a pioneer species, yellow birch is really intermediate, so it's mostly pioneer. This gives a symbol of rebirth, new beginnings and growth. It's a sacred tree within the mythology of the Celts and is thought to have very protective influences. To bring in the new year with goodness, evil spirits were brushed from homes using a broom made from the twigs of a birch tree. And on Midsummer's Eve, branches from the tree would be hung around doors of dwellings in hopes to bring good luck and guard against any evil misfortune. My final tree that I want to talk about here is beech. I'm a really big fan of beech. We only have one beech species in all of North America. Actually, I say just in the Northeast, but I believe that's a North America, and that's the American beech. We do have one non-native beech that you'll find planted a lot. As far as we know, it is not invasive, and that's the European copper beech. This one's really easy to identify in the woods through many characteristics. The buds are these long cigar-shaped buds that you can really see so evidently on the tree. And in the understory, the beech tree will often hold on to its leaves throughout the winter. They're not living, they have no chlorophyll, but they're hanging on the tree and the tree will hold on to them. The fruit of the tree is really important. It's a triangular shaped nut. It can be quite yummy at times, but then sometimes it can be a little bitter. So it really depends on the tree. And it's encased in this very spiny, spiky little husk. And you can find that on the ground and often still persisting in the tree. Bark of beech is classic. It is the tree that has very tight bark, gray, looks actually like an elephant foot. It's very, very characteristic. But right now, our beech trees are often, in what we call the aftermath forest in terms of beech bark disease. Most of our trees, probably 98% of them, beech trees, are impacted and infected with beech bark disease. A very small scale insect carries that disease into the tree by piercing and sucking on the sap, so that the insect actually causes no harm. It's the fungus it's carrying. And this fungus erupts into these little circles of multiple red bubbles. And the result of that is affecting the bark and can cause these small cankers all over the bark. Sometimes they're indented, sometimes they're pushed out. I can speak more to that at another time in terms of what beech bark disease is doing to our trees. But because of beech bark disease, this tree is not used a lot. You can still find some that are clean and clear, but if they're clean and clear, I strongly recommend not cutting them for any reason. So we're really not using much for lumber these days, but it is an amazingly good firewood and so very important as a wildlife food source. This is the critical tree to maintain the health of our black bear population across the state. You can identify the tree sometimes by those claw marks. So if you can see claw marks on a tree going all the way up a tree, that's going to be a beech tree. It can actually, you can see that on cherry sometimes, but not that long holding persistent marking. And this is what that looks like, those claw marks. You can also find where bears have made cribs or nests, we call them. But of course, their bears don't lay eggs, so they don't really have a nest. But what they do is they go up and sit in a fork of the tree or in a crotch with a sturdy branch, and they break the branches around it, stuffing those branches under their butt so that they can sit comfortably for a long period of time and then pull in the finer branches and feed off the nuts. This is my last slide before I turn it over, but just to talk a little bit about how important beech is culturally. Traditionally, the beech is called the queen or mother of the woods, sharing a place of honor with the kingly oak. As such, the beech is considered to be protective and nurturing, giving shade with its canopy and food that can be eaten in its raw state. It was said that no harm could befall a lost traveler who sought shelter under the branches of a beech. The beech has an association with knowledge and wisdom, writing and transmission of lore. Thin leaves or strips of beech wood are said to have been bound together to form the first book. and slivers of beech wood and leaves were once carried as talismans to bring good luck and increase energy. So that is all I have for slides. And I'm bringing it back to our gallery. And I know that Lisa's going to be queuing other people up. And I think there's some questions in the chat. I'm happy to answer.
Sure. Well, Caitlin gets her slides up. Nancy, there is one question about maple. They said, is the Norway maple what I have been told was Japanese maple?
No, so Japanese maple is more of a shrub, small tree. The leaves are very, very fine. Japanese maple, as far as I understand, is not invasive. There's another shrub maple that's highly invasive called amur maple, and those trees should be just outlawed. Japanese maple, though, is a beautiful tree. It has a difficult time growing in the colder regions of Vermont. It probably wouldn't grow there. So no, Norway maple and Japanese maple are not the same thing.
Great. So 2 more questions and then we'll turn it over to Caitlin. Michelle wanted to know if it's possible to receive a copy of your slides, and I'll answer that, Michelle. We actually didn't talk about that. I think that we can figure out a way to make that happen, and expect an email with the link on how we might be able to do that. So we'll figure out how to make that happen. And Lauren wants to know, are birches short-lived or long-lived species?
Depends on which species of birch you're talking about. Gray birch is a very short-lived tree. It starts to fall apart about 30 years old. Paper birch can live to be a biological lifespan of around 150 years and is very good, very best conditions. But yellow birch is a long-lived tree. Yellow birch can easily live to be 200 or 250 years old. So it really depends which species, and each of those species has a role to play in the ecosystem. Gray birch are really important as what we call a nurse crop. So they are providing the nutrients and the shade that allows a different species to become established. So all of these species have important roles in the ecosystem.
Great. Thank you, Nancy. And we'll turn it over to Caitlin. Caitlin, don't forget to unmute before you start speaking.
Thank you for that reminder. Well, hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm excited to see so many faces or names in the sidebar here. So my name is Caitlin Cusack. I live in Bristol with my husband and daughter. I'm a forester with the Vermont Land Trust. And today I'm going to cover 3 hardwood species for us. And it was really hard to choose, I think, what species we wanted to share, but ash being an important one, particularly in time right now, and then 2 other species, basswood and bitternut hickory, whose bark is easily confused. So I'll focus there. So we'll jump in and start with ash. It's in the olive family, the Oleaceae family. We have 3 species that are found here native in Vermont. That's white ash, green ash, and black ash. There are 16 species that are native to North America that you would find in other parts of the country. Ash is actually, our white ash is our 7th most common species here in Vermont. So I'll focus on that one. But those of you may be familiar by now, this little green bug in the bottom of the screen, this is the emerald ash borer. Unfortunately, all of our species of ash here in Vermont and then in the United States are threatened by this pest that was introduced. It's a non-native invasive pest that was introduced from Asia in the 1990s. So white ash is our most common ash you'll find, and it grows on kind of moist but well-drained, rich sites. And when I say rich, I'm really talking about calcium, sites with higher calcium. So it's a component of our northern hardwoods. So you'll see it growing with sugar maples and beech in different big areas. So let's see. Oops, that's not working. All right. There we go. Okay. Forwarding the slides. Skill number 1. So here we have, Nancy mentioned, ash is one of those that are oppositely branched. And you'll see ash does have a compound leaf. So those branches are thicker. They're pretty stout. Again, if you look up, you're going to really notice the difference in those branches versus maples, the other oppositely branched one that you'll see. The fruits, the seeds also have a wing like maple, but it's a single, it's not a paired helicopter like you see in maple. If we look at the buds, I don't have black ash up here because it's very different. Black ash you're going to find in wetlands. Green ash, you will also find that you'll find on wetter sites than the white ash. It's really limited to floodplains, to wetlands, mainly in the Champlain Valley. But you'll also find it's commonly planted. So if you see an ash on your street or in your yard, it very well may also be a green ash if it's not, specifically in a wetland. So I thought I'd go over just a couple of differences in when you're looking at the buds. So you'll see the U-shaped leaf scar. So that's the place where the leaf was attached in the growing season. And you'll see that lateral bud on top of it. Well, the lateral bud kind of dips into the leaf scar. And so it forms the leaf scar forms this U shape. Remember, white ash is Fraxinus americana. If this is helpful for you, the U shape is like a smile. You smile if you're proud to be an American. So that is your white ash. And then your green ash is a difference. You'll see the lateral bud just sit on that leaf scar. And so it has more of a flat top to it. And that's sort of the main way you're going to tell the difference. The bark is super, it's really hard to differentiate. So if you can think about where you are, and then if you can get a look at the bud, that will really help you be able to determine the difference between the two. So speaking of bud, on the left, we have white ash when it's young. It kind of starts to develop these sort of squarish rectangular blocks, which I'll then compare to sort of basswood and bitternut hickory as we get going. But when it's young, it is very different. It's when it gets older, it starts to develop these deep ridges, and it creates these ridges start to intersect to form this diamond pattern. So you'll see that it's these thicker ridges, especially on older trees. Is something to really look for. In addition, again, look for that opposite branching, look for that stout branches, and it will really help you determine that that's white ash. So it has many uses. It's a hardwood. In our house, we have it as floor joists and as braces for our timber frame. Can be used structurally. Baseball bats, big component, maple and ash are used in baseball bats, but there's the Louisville slugger. Tool handles, we do have a Ames True Temper in Wallingford, Vermont. It is an ash mill, and a lot of tool handles are made out of ash. It's a great firewood. If anyone's familiar with a firewood poem, but ashwood wet or ash dry, a king shall warm his slippers by. And then black ash, which I'll speak to in a little bit. Black ash is a species that you can make baskets out of. So there's my daughter. When she was a little bit younger, we stored her toys in a black ash basket that was given to my husband and I for a wedding present. And so ash and culture, it was interesting to look into this. In Norse mythology, apparently an ash tree stands at really the center of the world, and all the 9 realms in that mythology hang from the branches. And if something happens to one of the branches, it throws off the balance of the world. Apparently ash was thought to be a snake repellent. And then ash in terms of the Druids was one of the sacred trees kind of symbolizing connection and creativity and transition between those worlds. Here in North America, black ash, I mentioned, is a really important species to the Abenaki. It was the Abenaki believe that humans actually emerged from ash trees, so it's part of this origin story. Black ash has a really interesting property where you can peel the bark, and then the rings can separate, and you can pound the tree, literally kind of striking the end of the log with a mallet, and it separates those rings that can then be made into these splints that the Abenaki then create as a tradition and as a craft that artisans sell can make these most beautiful baskets out of black ash. So it's a really important species to the Abenaki, who have been critical partners in thinking about how do we preserve ash given the threat by the emerald ash borer. So that's ash. I'm going to move on to basswood. We have a native species, American basswood, Tilia. It's in the Malvaceae family, Tilia americana. You may be most familiar with basswood on streets. It's a commonly planted street tree, as the picture at the bottom shows. There are two non-native, non-invasive, I would mention, species that are commonly planted: little leaf linden and silver linden. I know there's many in Burlington and some smaller communities. So how do you identify basswood? Well, basswood's, our American basswood is not a super common tree. It's found, we'll find it growing with ash. It's a pretty site-specific tree that requires a lot of enrichment, so calcium and kind of moist, well-drained soils. Particularly our rich northern hardwood sites, you will find basswood. In fact, the basswood leaves themselves are extremely high in calcium, and so can help with some of that cycling back into the soil. So there, basswood is alternately branched. If you'll remember, Nancy shared with us that the bud itself is like a mouse with a motorcycle helmet. It's funny, I learned it as a monk with his hood up. But I realized I went to a Catholic college, so maybe that was like some of the influence there on. I love the mouse with the motorcycle helmet, though. That's kind of my favorite way to remember that one. You'll see the fruits of the seeds, are these little nutlets that are attached to this bract. It's also wind dispersed. That leaf structure can help the seeds be dispersed by the wind. And so diagnostics when it's young, it's kind of nondescript. It's got a grayer bark, smooth. So it is definitely different than ash, and you're not going to see very many of these the cracks that start to form. Basswood does sprout pretty readily, vigorously, I should say, from the stump, and so you will see multi-stemmed basswood quite commonly. And so as it matures, these ridges start to develop. They're long, and again, it can be a little confusing. It can be easily confused with white ash because the ridges do kind of intersect in some ways. And so you sometimes get a little bit of a diamond pattern, but it really doesn't have that. If you look at a sort of larger area, you're not going to see those diamond shapes in the basswood bark that you would in white ash. And again, just remember, it's alternately branched. You're not going to see the stout. It's a simple leaf. You're not going to see the stout branches that you're going to see in ash. And then just remember, it's a pretty site-specific species. You will find it growing with ash, but you're going to really need a richer site to be able to find basswood. And so its uses. I had a kind of a failed attempt at being a spoon carver, but a lot of people are very successful at carving with basswood. It's a softer wood. Apparently I learned that it is a good tone wood, and so it can be used in making musical instruments. The bottom right picture is just some of the finish in our house. We did harvest a basswood from our woods and used it in some of the trim. And beekeepers love it because apparently it's really fragrant and makes really nice honey. And then yellow-bellied sapsuckers. These, they will go after the sap in the tree. And so these holes in it they'll be able to sort of lick the sap from those holes. And it's a good way to determine if it's a basswood. If you're seeing this horizontal row of holes that are characteristic of sapsuckers, you're really not going to see that in any other hardwood species. You see it a lot on hemlocks, but basswood is really the main hardwood species you're going to see sapsucker damage on. So another just little trick, kind of, many different ways to figure out, is this the tree that is this a basswood that I'm looking at? And then basswood in culture, it was and really still is what they call a pointer plant for American ginseng. So where you would find American ginseng growing is around maidenhair fern and black cohosh, and then in sites where there's basswood. So rich calcium sites, that's where you would find ginseng. The fibrous bark apparently is also a source of basket material for the Abenaki. Interesting references to lindens in Germany, to elf kings lived under a linden tree. Even dragons were said to rest in its shade. In Germany and Hungary, lindens were planted outside of their houses to keep witches from entering. And if there are any herbalists in the group, the doctrine of signatures, the leaf. So here we have a basswood leaf, a linden leaf, and it's heart-shaped. And apparently one of its medicinal uses is thought to address blood pressure and be uplifting to the mood, so gentle on the heart. So that's its doctrine of signature. And so I'll wrap up here with bitternut hickory. This is in the Juglandaceae family. We have 4 species that are native to Vermont. Bitternut, I believe, is probably the most common that you'll find mainly in the Champlain and Connecticut River valleys. And there's its leaf. It's a compound leaf, so those branches are also going to be pretty stout, but they are alternate, just like the basswood, unlike our ash. So stout branches, but alternate. The bud is something like you just won't see anything else. That sulfur yellow. I think of it kind of like as 2 hands, almost in kind of a prayer, or just kind of held together. But that sulfur yellow bud, that is, you know you have bitternut hickory when you see that bud. It has a nut that's enclosed in a husk, and it's relatively small compared to shagbark hickory and our other 2 mockernut and pignut hickories. It has these, called, one word for them is wings, these 4 wings, so that when you open up the husk, it opens up in 4 pieces. But the wing only goes to the middle, unlike particularly shagbark and mockernut, where the wing goes all the way to the base of the nut. And so on our far right, you'll see the younger bark. These vertical lines really develop into vertical cracks. You're not going to really see that as much on basswood. Maybe young ash, you might start to see some vertical cracks like this, but they eventually quickly divide more to form on the left that pattern. The bitternut hickory tends to maintain a tight bark for a while, so it doesn't start to kind of divide as much as ash does. And so, but when it does get older, those ridges, the cracks start to divide and ridges start to form, and they really do start to intersect. And that's when it's like, sometimes at quick glance, it's like, oh, that's an ash. Oh, wait, no, it's a hickory. It does intersect to form this diamond shaped pattern. But what's interesting is the ridges, you can look on the white ash on the left, they're not flat topped like hickory. Hickory has this really flat sort of top surface of the ridge. It's not quite as angular as ash. And then again, you want to make sure, looking up, hickory is alternate. And you also might see commonly, I know our bitternut hickories have a lot of this, it's called Phomopsis gall. It's this gall, this growth in the picture on the bottom right there. And that it won't kill a tree. If it gets into the main stem of the tree, it can affect the, timber, the economic value of the tree. But that you might commonly see in a hickory. And so if you're seeing that sort of gall in the crown on the branches, again, just another thing to put together to say, oh, that, must be a hickory, not an ash necessarily. So hickory, it's a really hard wood. Historically it was used in wagon wheels, still very much used to make tool handles, firewood, smoking meat. Hickory is certainly used for that. We harvested some bitternut hickory from our woods and had it milled into flooring. It just made a beautiful pattern. The sapwood is that lighter color, and then the heartwood is that, it's almost like a pink. It's not finished in this case. Well, finished now, but my house is a little too cluttered to share a picture of it, what it looks like right now, but can make really beautiful flooring. And I didn't find too many references to hickory and culture, so would certainly love to hear if anyone has any cool stories about hickory. But I did find that it is one species that is used by the Abenaki to create snow snakes, which is a winter sport that a number of tribes, I believe, even beyond the Abenaki, do play. And so you'll carve these wooden stakes that are the snow snake, and then you throw them down what looks like a kind of mini luge made of snow for the snow snake, and whoever can throw their snow snake the longest wins. And many of them are decorated and dyed in really sort of beautiful patterns. So again, hickory is one of the woods that's made into. And then I did find some references that the early settlers used the nut oil to treat rheumatism, and had used it for oil lamps. So that is the end there. I will stop sharing and see if we have any couple of questions.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. And we'll let Emily start working to share her screen. Leslie shares that, and I like this, ash seed shaped like a canoe paddle, which is a good use for ash wood. So
Great.
It's a good way to describe it. And I love, that's one of the things that you'll encounter on Saturday is this is sort of a one-way type of education, but when we do the learning circles, we want you to share all the things that your cues are on for trees. So, Nancy shared that it was like a mouse with a helmet, where Caitlin said it was like a monk with a hood. So, what resonates with you? I've heard cherry bark described as potato chips. So again, what is it that brings that cue to your head? So you're like, yes, I know what that tree is. So that was an interesting comment. We also had a question that we're not going to have time to answer on what do you do about ash in the face of emerald ash borer? We have a lot of talks that have been done. There are some recorded YouTube videos on Covered's page, on some other pages that will discuss that. And any of your county foresters here in Vermont would be happy to talk with you about that very issue. Or you can contact any one of us at a later date. But we really want to focus on the ID because so we can get through that. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Emily for her tree species.
Okay. Hi, I'm Emily Potter. I'm the Lamoille County Forester with the Vermont Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. I'm coming to you from East Calais, Vermont today. Here to talk about identification techniques of eastern white pine, red spruce, and eastern hemlock, as well as to provide some information about their present day uses and cultural significance. So in my opinion, tree ID, as Nancy and Caitlin have both mentioned, it's all about training your eyes to recognize the different distinguishing features. Silhouettes are all different, and so you can, with some practice, begin to identify trees from afar just using their silhouettes. If you take a look at the picture on the left, it's a balsam fir, a red spruce, and an eastern hemlock growing next to each other. As Nancy mentioned, you can see that narrow spire top of the fir in comparison to the more pyramidal shape of the red spruce. And then this hemlock has kind of a feathery shape to it, lacy in appearance with these drooping branch tips. And then the white pine in the center is pretty distinctive in comparison to those trees. It has kind of a pillowy appearance with upswept branches. And so, did I just skip? Yeah. So if you're close to a young tree, or if you just have a good view of the branching pattern of a tree you're trying to identify, you can narrow down the possibilities just by looking at the branching arrangement. The branches of eastern white pine and red spruce grow in whorls. So each year they put on a whorl that encircles the stem. And so you can actually estimate the tree's age by counting the number of whorls. And alternatively, eastern hemlocks are alternately arranged. So instead of being oppositely branched like maples or ash, they have this alternate branching pattern. And bark, as everyone else has mentioned, is a great identification tool. However, it's a little less critical in the case of conifers because we have the needles year round, or at least these three conifers retain their needles year round. So you can gather a lot of information from the bark, the texture, the color, blockiness, furrows or scales, presence or absence of resin blisters. So with white pine bark, when the tree is young, it's smoother and it's this grayish green color. And as it ages, the bark develops these broad, blocky, furrowed ridges. And the same with eastern hemlock, when the tree is younger, the bark is kind of smoother and flat looking. But as it ages, the bark becomes kind of a cinnamon brown color with thick ridges that kind of turn into these flat plates. And then red spruce, whoops, sorry about that. Red spruce bark is kind of gray brown to reddish brown when the tree is young. And then as it ages, it kind of gets scalier. I think it looks kind of scaly. Some people describe it as looking like burnt cornflakes. The needles are also distinctive of these three species. Red spruce needles are short and shiny. They're four-sided. They encircle the entire twig. They're prickly to the touch, and they're attached to the twig on these woody pegs that are called sterigma. You can see those sterigma in this photo here. Eastern white pine needles are quite different. They're 3 to 5 inches long, and they're soft and flexible to the touch. And they're grouped together by a fascicle that attaches them to the stem. And then eastern hemlock needles are flat. They're about 1/2 inch in length. And on their underside, they have some 2 parallel white lines. Their twigs look kind of fine and lacy. And as I mentioned earlier, they droop at the tip. So the cones of these species all differ in size. One thing that they share is that they're pendant, so they dangle on the branch, which is different than balsam fir, whose cones stand upright on the branch. So red spruce cones are just 1.5 inches long. Eastern white pine cones are 4 to 8 inches long, and eastern hemlock cones are 3/4 of an inch. I don't know why my slides are going ahead themselves, but that's okay. Anyway, so as I mentioned earlier, silhouettes of trees are all pretty unique, and they're great for ID from afar. Eastern white pine trees have crowns with horizontal parallel branches. They put on 1 whorl each year. And when compared to other more pointy conifers, I think their upswept branches look like they'd be accommodating if you were falling out of a plane. That's something one of my biology teachers in high school said. I think she's right. It just looks like it'd be a soft place to land. The silhouette of eastern hemlocks, on the other hand, is looser and more feathery looking. They have these fine, lacy branch tips that droop gracefully. And the silhouette of red spruce is more pyramidal in shape. They often grow these beautifully straight trunks, and their tops are pointy, but less so than that spire top balsam fir. You can see they just have kind of a broader appearance. So I'd like to talk about some historical and present day uses of these 3 species and give you a taste of their cultural significance. So eastern hemlock was used by many Native American tribes to treat a variety of ailments, including arthritis, colds, fever, skin conditions, stiff joints, soreness, and scurvy. Native Americans also used the bark to make dyes, and they used the cambium for the base for breads and soups, or they made pemmican out of it, mixing it with animal fat and fruit. And hemlock bark was once the primary source of tannin for the leather industry, so to dye leather in colonial America, which led to widespread harvesting of hemlock, which is what's happening in this picture here, simply for its bark. But luckily, synthetic tanning agents replaced hemlock tannins in the early 20th century. Red spruce is primarily used for lumber and pulpwood, though it's preferred for tone wood for piano sounding boards, guitars, mandolins, organ pipes, violin bellies. In the 1800s, there was an entire industry developed around the sap, which is known as spruce gum, that is exuded by wounds on spruce trees. Woodsmen harvested the gum from the spruce trunks using a pole. They'd pry the resin nuggets from the tree and collect them for chewing gum. And it was a big business in Maine. And Native Americans used the spruce gum as salve for skin irritations, and sores. So the resins of white pines were used by Native Americans for coughs and chest congestion. The inner bark was also peeled and pounded into a flour that I've heard is still considered an excellent survival food today, though it might be an acquired taste. The sap of white pines is naturally antibacterial, and it was historically used as a treatment for wounds. The long, straight trunks of white pines were used as ship masts. And today, white pine is one of our most commonly used types of lumber in the Northeast. Okay, so I'm sorry my slides are advancing on their own, but the eastern hemlock, it's a tree with one of the longest lifespans in our forest. It can live to be more than 800 years old, rivaling some of the trees of the Pacific coast. And many Native American legends feature eastern hemlock and tell of its magical qualities, providing warmth and heat and used as an aid to magical transformation. In Greek mythology, the spruce tree was dedicated to Artemis, the goddess of the moon, hunting, nature, and protector of women. The Greeks suggested that the enduring spruce tree represented constant eternal life, and it was labeled the tree of birth. Its scented evergreen needles signifying resilience and strength. And lastly, the white pine tree is said to have been chosen by the peacemaker as a symbol of the unity of the 5 nations of the Iroquois people. Its needles, which always grow in clusters of 5, are symbolic of the uniting of the 5 nations. And the white pine tree's broad branches provide shelter and a gathering place for the people. So that's all.
Great, thank you, Emily. Give me a moment while I pin everybody back in there so that you're not all alone. So thank you all for joining us. If there's any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat box. I'm having trouble with this. And then we will answer those. There's some chat going on about EAB in there. And so we would like everyone to realize that EAB is something to be concerned about. And there's a lot of information online, and your county foresters would be happy to answer any questions for you, as would we under a different format. I am going to put in the chat box our link to the weekend learning circles that we're going to be doing. Put that in the chat box right now. And so there's a question that Beth has is, how common is black birch in Vermont and where is it found?
I'll answer that. Black birch is really common in Vermont, but it isn't actually all the way up to the north. There is not, as far as I know, a single black birch growing in Franklin County, but there is black birch growing in Chittenden County, which is just south of Franklin County. And it's one of the most common species now in southern Vermont, primarily due to the overbrowsing of the far too many deer that we have in much of our landscape, where the deer are eating pretty much everything else except for black birch. So very, very common species.
Great. And that characteristic of the blistering lenticels on balsam fir, do we know why they do that, or why they're there? It's just a question.
It's interesting. I don't have a why. I actually don't know. That would be really fun to find out. I'm sure someone has looked into the evolutionary advantage of that. I do know that black bear love balsam fir because they can leave their scent within the blisters in the scent that's exuding from the balsam fir, that pushes, it's so volatile, it carries the scent of the black bear further too, so that they can communicate with their future partners and relatives.
Great. Well, it is 1 o'clock, so we want to respect everybody's time. We want to thank you all for joining us on the WOW Vermont presentation on Winter Tree ID. We hope that you'll consider joining us in future programs, be it online or in person. We do have the learning circles occurring this weekend in Guilford. The weekend after, it's going to be in Belvedere and also in Waltham. And the fourth weekend, the fourth one will be in Montpelier the first weekend in March. And that'll give you a chance to practice some of these skills and work out and share different characteristics that you know and that we can teach you. So it should be a lot of fun, and we hope you'll join us. Thank you to Nancy, Emily, and Caitlin for breaking things down for us. And we look forward to seeing everyone in the future. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.